Thanks everyone for joining. So this is our precision fertilization session. And just out of curiosity, does everyone in the room know what precision fertilization means? Is that something that a term familiar to everyone? Is there anyone who doesn't have a good idea what that is? Okay. I just want to make sure I don't have to introduce any definitions or anything like that on the front end here. This topic actually emerged from conversations I had with Josh McGrath from OCP. He has some really interesting data that's come out about soil testing and the resolution needed to properly inform fertility recommendations for precision ag. And Josh was really kind enough to put all the speakers together, and we really have a great panel of speakers for this. So his paw prints are all over this. He wasn't able to make it. He's in transition from his job at OCP to a new job at USDA, so he had to bow out of this session as a result. But I wanted to thank him for putting this together. As many of you know, precision ag has a lot of promise for delivering better agronomic yields with reduced input costs and lower environmental externalities, but it really hasn't been adopted at the rates that it should have been or could have been possibly. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, and we're going to talk about some of the issues with soil testing and the development of fertility recommendations and other topics. We've got a great panel, and I'm going to introduce them one at a time as they come up with their bios. After the panel, we'll have some moderated discussion. We'll open it up for some Q&A as well. I also want to thank ARVA Intelligence. So we have as you know, we're a member-funded organization at the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance. ARVA stepped up with some funding to put this panel together, and we couldn't have really put this together without their help. And so I wanted to give a few minutes to John McIntyre, who's their Director of Communications, to tell you a little bit about ARVA, and then we'll move on to the panel after that. So John, you want to take over?
Thank you all for letting us be a part of it. We're very excited to be here and very honored to be among such an esteemed room as this. We're really excited for the panel, and none of y'all came here to hear me talk, so I'll keep it short, but I wanted to tell you all a little bit about what we did. We're an AI platform for agronomics and sustainability quantification, and some of y'all may have heard of us, some may not, but if you haven't, we started this project that quickly spiraled out of control to where we are today from my own personal family farm, down right outside of Stuttgart, originally as a research project with the Department of Energy and the University of Arkansas to help study phosphate mobilizing microbes. From there, we had to figure out how do we house all the data. Everything was siloed in different places, so we tried to build something to bring it all under one house. And today, we're now proud to announce that we are working heavily in the offset and inset markets for sustainability and carbon, and have just paid out $20 million to farmers this year. And so we are very invested still in research and quality and importance of data. So we are very excited for everything that these panelists are contributing today. So thank you very much, and I'm glad to be here.
John is a professor at The Ohio State University, where his research and extension focuses on digital agriculture, machinery automation, and use of spatial data to improve crop production and the farm business. He helps lead the digital program at Ohio State and is serving as president for the International Society for Precision Agriculture. And thanks, John. I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, John, for sponsoring this session. So, with four of us kind of leading through this, my primary responsibility today was just to talk a little bit about adoption of precision ag specifically, and of course we're talking about phosphorus, and then kind of just highlight some of the technology that's available today at the farm level. So we'll start here in Jess will be talking to us as one of the authors of this, just talking about adoption of VRT at the farm, and in particular this would be for the U.S. And to come, some of the Matt's comments is, you know, this is not a new concept, right? When we started this journey when embedding some of the GPS technology and leading the guidance, and then we started that discussion in the early 90s with commercialization in the mid 90s, and now we're here in 2024, okay, essentially 30 years later, talking very similarly about where are we at on this kind of progression to what we now describe as digital ag. And so as you look, the blue dots is corn. It started in 98, going out to 2017, and then you see, a little bit of variability with some notion there that 2010, 2012 could have been because of high grain prices with some margins. Farmers tend to invest, okay, not only in technology, but if there's cash there, they'll invest some other practices as well on the farm. So that's one thing, but you notice that in this particular study is adoption, US-wise is fairly low as of recent. From 2010, I thought I'd throw this, and this is up until Mark Bratt was doing a study in Ohio, and this gets into some of the variability that you'll start to see as you move around the U.S., okay? And so this is from 2010, and this was the last time this study was done, was the VRT, potassium, phosphorus, and lime were all around 19%, 18.8 to just under 20% was kind of that in 2010. And you notice there from what we describe as kind of precision soil sampling. So you'll hear terms like gridding the field and then sampling those grids, or zoning the field and then sampling in those zones, right? And then trying to manage to that only about a little under 23% were actually doing that. And in general, when you look at a lot of data, there's more sampling going on at a kind of site-specific nature than there are applications, in particular for phosphorus. But other than that, back then, 76% felt there was benefits according to Precision Ag. Now, again, this is 2010. And of any of the Precision Ag practices, the variable rate application of fertilizer was most profitable at that time, okay? And so, again, we haven't done anything beyond that at Ohio State since 2010. But I'll show you some information that we're getting a little bit more to kind of the water scale, watershed. So, with that, this has been going on since the 90s. This has probably been, when we talk about things of whether it's a top-option or what's available to farmers, that's probably what's more reflective out of this. But the Crop Life Purdue, again, Jess has a big hand in that. And what we're really looking at is the red line in my mind sitting here today. And the red line represents variable rate fertilizer application. I'll note some of that coming up here in a second. And then the orange, or not the orange, excuse me, the gold line is lime. And then for us, especially in Ohio, if you're going to talk variable rate fertilizer, you're also talking variable rate seeding. That's all done in the same sentence when you're talking to growers about these services today. But you've seen the growth. I was just telling Jess, in my mind, we're starting to see these services that are available to growers kind of plateau, okay? And when I describe this as far as nutrition and then the seeding, and then what you're seeing a little bit on the brown line is crop protection in particular, but we won't get into that today, is we've really matured in what's available to farmers today in the U.S. So I personally don't know any retailer that doesn't have the software combined with the application equipment that's equipped with variable rate technology to provide the services today. Okay, and we're very efficient with that today. As an example, to go from sampling to a prescription map used to take us over 20 steps. It was kind of clunky and it was expensive. Today, if you're not doing that process in 5 steps, you're not very efficient, okay, at least for the retailers that I get to work with. But it's from iPad to put in, looking at you, Ron, I put my sales in, and that just basically goes through a profilate system. And next thing you know, someone's out there in the fall typically sampling. They don't even know who you are. They know where your field is. And boom, as soon as that comes back from the lab, that's suitably automatically combined, and an application map's then sent out via telematics to the machine today, okay? And so we're very efficient, but the point is its services here are very readily available. We're set up to support variable rate phosphorus. In another tone, the question, and I appreciate you guys putting this in, is data. We had John standing up here talking about data and some of that. Data is becoming more and more important to inform fertility recommendations or fertility decisions, okay? And so you look again, the red line and then the gold line, there's phosphorus and P and K and then liming, but you're starting to see, somewhere around 40%, maybe just a little bit above that, data is being used to inform. We can get into that discussion during our panel, but you're starting to see more and more data being part of evaluation and imparted in or brought into the discussion and making that final decision to some degree. Okay? So, come to today, this is some recent data. We'll have, this group will have 2 reports coming out, hopefully in 2022. When you move around, in particular in Ohio, and this is at the HUC 8 level, okay, and I want to kind of emphasize a few things, but this is one of the watersheds in northwest Ohio. You look, 75% of the fields in that HUC 8 are precision sampled. Again, grid or zone, we can talk about which one that is, but the point is they're being sampled. 62% of those fields, you see variable rate phosphorus in that particular watershed being applied to. All right? Of a note here, I thought it was important to throw in that farmers are heavily reliant on their service providers to provide those variable rate technologies, the variable rate application piece. Granted, some farmers have that, but majority of them, as it relates to phosphorus, are going to be looking at their service provider to provide that technology to them, okay? Now, the question we get into, and what we, in fact, had a meeting earlier this week talking about some of this, is, but are we doing it right? Just because we're going out and doing variable rate phosphorus application, is it the right thing to do for the right reasons? Okay, and there's a lot of things embedded underneath that comment, but we question, you know, we think we can do better, okay, is our answer. We can improve what we're doing, how we're informing, how we're executing, and what we're doing out there on the field, both from the profitability of the farmer, but more so to, I think, the discussions today, even improving some of the environmental management or concerns that are out there on some of this. So, just a few things. When we talk precision ag, we're not going to go through all this. My point in this is there's a lot of technology today on U.S. farms. And so when I purchase a new tractor, I purchase a modern combine or harvesting unit, even sugar cane. If I purchase a sprayer today, that technology is embedded in these machines. Okay, that doesn't mean the farmer's using it, but I purchased those machines and the technology on it. We go back in the early days, I had to always get into the conversation of retrofitting, right? I'd have to put a guidance system on, or I had to put variable rate technology on the machine. Today, that's not a discussion, okay? And more so when you get to the bottom, all those machines are sold connected to the internet. Now, majority of that's done through cellular connectivity. So if there isn't cellular connectivity, obviously there's going to be some challenges there. But the point is, as soon as it comes out of the manufacturing plant, that manufacturer is watching that machine as it gets delivered either to the dealership or to the farm. And that brings some value to this process of informing or getting prescriptions in and as applied data back out of these machines as it relates to phosphorus management too. This is what a modern cab looks like. Okay, this is just one example a farmer's going to get, or an operator in most cases are going to get a lot of feedback. But just to highlight there's a lot of spatial data being collected as well. We can talk about yield maps, but today we know about where every piece of fertilizer gets at least placed with a planter and where every seed per se. All that information is not only communicated to the operator, okay, you got an issue or everything's going well, but I get a bunch of maps out of this as well. This is what a modern broadcast applicator looks like. I'll show you another one here in a second, but note here, this is basically a new leader bed, very commonly used here in the U.S. You know, you can't go to almost a retail and not see some kind of bed, a G4 or a G5 bed, but you notice there's two bins on that. Again, as we go back even 10, 20 years ago, you'd always seen single bin applicators. But today, the opportunities is I can go to the field and actually spread with one pass multiple nutrients. It's not heavily common, but that's where we're heading, okay? And you couple that, at least in the state of Ohio, where if I was showing you some other data, we're moving more to annual applications. Not every 2 years covering a field for my phosphorus requirements. We're more and more pushing to every year type of application. So not as much, more frequently, more of a sense of trying to feed that crop in some sense, okay? So here's an Air Max, very similar machine, a little different in how it applies fertilizer, but this Airco, it's high clearance, gives me opportunities to go in season, okay, and we're seeing some farmers take advantage of that as well. It's a two-bin setup, so I can put two products. I can put my potash in, or I can put my MAP or DAP in, one of the others, which is common. It's variable rate enabled. Again, I buy the machine, it comes enabled with this, with the receiver already on it. And oh, by the way, it's connected to the internet, so I can push and pull data to and from that machine today, okay? So there's some value to that. So I just wanted to highlight this. It's an example of one of the growers. Here's two prescription maps. Both prescription maps go in that machine I showed you prior. And independently out there, I'm applying, in this case, MAP on the left and then potash on the right. And we know anytime we build these prescription maps, neither one of those align exactly, right, where the highs and lows are in the exact same spot. But I'm now, and you're starting to see this more coupled with this dual bin technology, can execute that with one pass, okay? With that, we now have capabilities on our spinner spreaders to do things like section control. This is where if I go in an area that's already applied to, it shuts off. In this case, I can map out a grass waterway, and I can go across that grass waterway, and as it goes across, it actually turns sections of that machine on and off, so I'm not applying into that grass waterway. A lot of the field efficiencies come with this. If I can map out those green areas, buffers, grass waterways, this technology now on these spinner spreaders will turn it off and then turn it back on regardless of what angle it goes across that at. So that's some of the value we're getting out of the technology. You're seeing the section control heavily adopted in the retail sector on these type machines. Not necessarily 12 sections, but we're able to do that today on these machines. With that, just a few comments, and I just want to kind of highlight that those data coming from those machines are automatically, especially after a job is complete, is then basically communicated up into a cloud. And there's a lot of things coming down the road. This is actually from John Deere as one example, but you can see where the machines are. And then there's some things beyond just agronomy that you can do, but logistically you can start managing machines as well. So we're connecting the machines. We know where those machines are, and we can kind of line them up and figure out where we want to execute certain field operations when, based on weather and other factors. So just want to highlight that there's this idea, this connectivity in these cloud platforms behind that. So in closing, I'll make these comments, and this is from where a few things. Farmers continue to be influenced, at least in our areas, heavily by retailers and consultants, okay, in terms of phosphorus management. To me, the nutrient application toolbox is pretty large. We have probably outpaced the technology and the application technology available than what we understand how to best use it in many cases. Data is becoming more important and being used. You know, I'll tell you a story sitting here today, you know, dealing with a couple growers yesterday. They're going through right now, because of the higher fertilizer prices, making decisions later than normal of what fields they're not going to apply P and K to this year because of the higher prices. But they're using the data, specifically the precision soil data, to go field by field to make those decisions, to prioritize fields to apply to or those fields not to. Variability in soil tests does not mean that I need to make management changes. Again, I think our panel hopefully will get into some of those discussions about that. To me, and most importantly, is as we look at moving from more of a composite or a fixed rate application to a true variable rate phosphorus application, we have to go back and look at our university recommendations. Okay, we're in a situation now in Ohio trying to think about how do we make things more regional or more site specific. Okay, we heard the terminology again this morning, silver bullet doesn't fit all. But what fits one grower and what's happening in one area of Ohio is not the same that may fit, especially in the recommendations. And we're starting to see artificial intelligence and some of the data sets starting to be kind of scrubbed and kind of understand potentially how to inform that. But the point is the current recommendations to cover the whole state is not what we need to support precision for phosphorus management. So with that, my last comment is we look at our HUC 8 data, it varies. Okay, I just want to emphasize to you as we move around Ohio, You saw some 60-some% were doing VRT phosphorus. There's some that's much lower than that. And so we're hoping that that kind of data will help better, inform some of the research that's going on kind of at the watershed scale to be able to more accurately reflect some of the practices that are being going on. But it varies in time significantly between the Huck 8s. So with that, Matt, thanks.
If there's one or two quick questions right now, we can field those. Anyone have a question?
Yeah.
So my question has to do with the fact that farmers are getting a lot of this guidance from the retailers. Have you seen or talked with many farmers who have an interest in kind of figuring out how to do it in-house so that that they can shop the market for pricing on equipment and inputs?
So there are a handful of growers that have made the investment to either a pulled style type spreader or converting like planters to put phosphorus on. So yeah, some of them are interested, but some of the challenges with some of that is just timing, not only having time to do it, but the timing of when they want to get that done. And so it's just another piece. But I would say in general, most of them aren't going to make the capital investment to buy one of those large machines, for example. That's a pretty significant investment to not, what kind of return do I get on something like that? So I just rely on my retailer to provide the machine and the technology on the machine to do whatever we're in agreement to do.
Maybe one more quick one? No?
Good.
Okay.
Thanks.
John. Yeah. So Scott Shearer received his PhD in agricultural engineering from Ohio State in 1986. I almost read 1886. That would have been rude. Currently, he serves as professor and chair of food, agricultural, and biological engineering at Ohio State. Highlights of his research career include development of methodologies and controls for spatial application of crop production inputs, autonomous multi-vehicle field production systems, strategies for deployment of SUAS in agriculture, and rural broadband connectivity. You're up, Scott.
So I was sitting over here with Steve Phillips, and Steve said, I looked through all the slide sets, and he goes, I have no idea what the hell you're going to talk about. So I'll start off with that. What I'm going to try to do is talk about some of the technologies that are coming, okay, and I think are going to affect how farmers manage nutrients, okay? This may be next year, it may be 5 years, it may be 10 years down the road, but a lot of this stuff is kind of coming to fruition today. Ohio State University was recently awarded a couple of the NSF Artificial Intelligence Center. Computer scientists, great people, I love working with them, but they don't understand agriculture, okay? And I don't think that's a surprise to anybody in this room in some respects. ICICL in this case is, and you can't make this up, computational intelligence for artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence for computational intelligence. When we think about the deployment of AI, you got to think about how it's going to be deployed, okay? The use cases are food systems, one of the use cases, and then one of the other use cases is digital agriculture, okay? So I'm going to kind of talk from this perspective as I go through this. Convolutional neural networks, I'm not going to get too deep in these, but basically it's an opportunity to take images and make decisions based on those images, okay? And I'll give you some examples of this. Won't get into the details of how convolutional neural networks work. Had a PhD student, and we developed or assembled a crop stress data set, okay? It's about 10,000 images. We did one for corn, did one for soybeans. One of the things we learned in that, 10,000 images is not enough, okay? When you start thinking about artificial intelligence, I've got to get people kind of change the narrative here. We're not talking about thousands of images. We're not talking about tens of thousands of images, nor 100,000s of images. We're typically going to be talking about millions of images, okay? So as we deploy AI in agriculture, and I'm going to show you some products coming up, the cost, the expense is really going to be an annotation of the data sets, in this case, the image data sets, okay? This is a confusion matrix. We have what the image was that we input, and then we have how it was classified. We call it a confusion matrix, but it begins to tell us where some of our errors are occurring. And this happened to be in soybeans. And you'll notice right up here, we had a number of these frog eye leaf spot images misclassified as bacterial blight. And so this allows us to kind of go back and think about where AI went wrong. Everybody's talking about AI today. It's a black box. We also have this emerging area called explainable AI. I'm going to tell you right now, when you go out to farmers, they don't like black boxes. AI will give you an answer, and that's one of the things we have to learn to contend with. The question you have to ask yourself, is it a good answer or not? We got to doing some of this stuff where we were trying to replace the Crop Scout. So we had a drone, we had what we called a stinger on it, and we would insert cameras down into the plant canopy. Rationale, when we see nutrient stresses, where do we see them? Bottom of the canopy. By the time we detect them at the top, it's a post-mortem, okay? So there's a lot of people flying over plant canopies, and I get that, and there's a lot of good things you can do, but there's also some things you can't do in terms of trying to rescue the crop. And that's the point that I want to make here, okay? What's driving all this? One company, a lot of other companies out there, I don't want to take anything away from anybody, but NVIDIA, okay? They got into GPUs for gaming, they got into cryptocurrencies, and now they're building these GPUs for artificial intelligence deployment. This is a Raspberry Pi format. Originally, we started buying these things, $99, okay? We're able to process and classify about 5 to 15 images a second. This is some of the technology that's being deployed in agriculture today, okay? We put this together, and we were actually flying and mapping weeds using AI to classify the weed locations in the field, okay? And so as we begin to think about how this is going to roll out and be used in other areas, I think this issue of crop nutrient stressors is going to be another big issue, or a big area. Products in the marketplace, Deere has See and Spray. Depending upon the size boom you have multiple cameras across the boom, several blade processors. Obviously, they've developed the intelligence for green on green. When I talk about green on green, I'm talking about spraying weeds within the canopy. As you look across the spray boom, you'll notice there's only a few nozzles on, okay? We're seeing somewhere between a 60 to 90% reduction in herbicide application. This is certainly post, okay? Deere is the first company in the market. I want to be careful there. But there's others. Bosch and BASF have a joint partnership, okay? My understanding is they will be introducing their product sometime during 2024 in the U.S., okay? But again, another camera AI-driven product. Green Eye Technology out of Israel. They have a product in the U.S. now. I think their headquarters are out in Lincoln, Nebraska, okay? And then there was a company out of France called Bilberry. Trimble bought Bilberry. Trimble has an intent of beginning to market this product in the U.S. this year, okay? Whether or not they make it or not, that'll be another big question. But again, everything now is green on green, specifically spray weeds. We're also thinking there could be 200 to 300 use cases for this technology in the state of Ohio. We think we might be using it for tillage. Think about adjusting the tillage tool to leave a certain amount of residue on top of the soil surface. Think about how we use it to manage wheat. We give it a shot of nitrogen to promote tillering if we don't see enough of a stand, okay, in terms of intensive wheat management. So all these are use cases, and we have to think about the data sets that are going to go into those. Large language models. Everybody's probably been online and gotten one of those bots, right, that begins answering your question, trying to help you buy things on Amazon. Everybody's experienced that, right? You actually think somebody's on the other end of that typing back to you, but no, it's a bot. Large language models, okay, and I want to get you thinking about this. What is it? Oxford Dictionary has, 267,000 words in it? I think you're considered fluent in English if you know somewhere between 20 and 35,000 words, okay? But then think about everything that's being published, okay? Large language models, they begin looking at word associations. There's input and output vectors, and I want to carefully get you thinking about this in terms of what this might mean. A lot of online capabilities. Everybody's familiar with ChatGPT. Well, the reality of it is we can go in and train these large language models, okay? We got to know some things. We need knowledge graphs. We need ontology. And that's where the subject matter experts have to come in, okay? Computer scientists are not going to do this by themselves, okay? It's going to be people in this room that know and understand soil fertility that's going to help integrate these large language models into making soil fertility recommendations, okay? Got on Google Scholar, an exercise, and I wondered about phosphorus management in corn grain production. It returned 278,000 published journal articles. And I'm thinking to myself, if we cultivate that correctly and we use that to train large language models, how does that advance nutrient management? Again, this is all text-based or text-driven. And these are some of the things we're doing at Ohio State with that project NSF Center in AI. Switch gears a little bit, 360 rain. Is anybody familiar with that? It's a high-clearance robotic irrigation system, okay? 360 Yield Center, which is the family that founded Precision Planting. Once they sold it off, they went back and reformed, and this is one of their, I'm going to say, most successful products. When I say robotic irrigation system, doesn't make any difference how you plant the field. You put a GPS receiver on the planter, you identify where you planted the crop, that creates a file. The machine irrigates on the way out and irrigates on the way back, okay? The blue areas in the field have been covered. The green one, it's on its way out. The black one is yet to be covered. Puts on about 4 inches of precipitation a year. We argued with the people at 360 Yield Center. They told me it was a water applicator. I told them it was a nutrient applicator, okay? They went to the National Farm Machinery Show a couple years ago, got interest things filled out. 80% of the people were animal producers, okay? Think about changing the dynamic of applying animal nutrient sources. Now we can do it all during the growing season, okay? Remember, part of our problems have been springtime, you go out and you apply animal manure before you plant your crop. Everybody does it at the same time. We get those spring rainfall events, and what happens with the phosphorus and dissolved reactive phosphorus. So again, going to be some great opportunities here. The custom applicators can apply manure all summer long. The quantities are going to be much lower. It will be integrated into the irrigation water. But in my estimation, this is one of those game changers in terms of nutrient management. By the way, you can apply commercial fertilizers as well. Comment on a couple of these devices. I'm going to wrap up pretty quickly here. This is out of Australia, Swarm Farm. They had a couple of machines here in the U.S. This past winter, okay? This company has 54 of these autonomous sprayers out. They sell them for about $170,000, okay? I went back and did the math. They were originally leasing them. Their cost of application, exclusive of chemicals and fuel, about $1 an acre, okay? Is that going to rival custom application in the U.S. in some respects? The other thing is these machines are weather responsive. What do I mean by weather responsive? If the wind speed gets too high, they shut these machines down. If an inversion is predicted, they shut these machines down. The owners of the company were in Columbus, were eating lunch. 54 of these machines out across the continent of Australia, if you will. And I asked them, I said, how many of those machines are operating? Well, over half of them were inactive. I said, what's that mean? They're in the barn. Then there was a bunch that were active but sleeping. I said, well, why are they sleeping? They goes, well, it's nighttime. Okay. Then there were about 4 or 5 running, and I said, why are those machines running if it's nighttime? They said, because the weather conditions allow the machines to run. So think about 24/7 application and being able to do some of these things. By the way, the base machine is a robot, okay? Don't worry about the sprayer. You can put anything on it you want. Here in the U.S., Sabanto, this is an automation package you drop on a utility tractor, okay? That's a Kubota M5. We've been using one of these at Ohio State, but I keep thinking to myself, if I have to do subsurface placement of phosphorus in the springtime, and one of the biggest things is being able to cover acres, I drop one of these machines off in a few different fields, and I go on and do whatever else, okay? All these devices are internet connected. I want to emphasize, all these devices are internet connected. When there is no connection, the machine stops, okay? And so one of the things I'm greatly concerned about is our future in terms of connectivity. It is quite likely when we send that fertilizer applicator into the field and or the sprayer into the field, we're not only going to download the prescription file, we're going to download the intelligence for that day, that crop, that stage of growth, perhaps even the residue in the background, and the tillage methodology. and the historical weather patterns up to that point in time. This is where we're headed, and by the way, we're going to have that connectivity. So with that, if there's any quick questions, I'd be happy to answer those, and if not, we'll go on to the next speaker. A glimpse in the future in terms of some technology and how it might affect.
Is this on? There it is. Okay. How does cybersecurity come into play here?
Yeah, that's great. How does cybersecurity come into play? Cybersecurity is important, okay? But I also have to ask myself, if I'm going to do something nefarious, I want to make the headlines. Does doing something nefarious to a small, low-horsepower tractor in the middle of Nebraska, does that make the headlines? Or does something on a freeway in LA, does it make the headlines? I'm not saying that we don't have cybersecurity concerns to worry about, and I'm going to say largely agriculture has been lax. I'm going to give you an example. A lot of vertically integrated animal operations, okay? All the feed mills are very vulnerable. If I wanted to attack the U.S., okay, the food supply, I'd go attack the feed mills because I know there's only about 3 to 4 days of animal feed on the farms. And so as we look to the future, there's going to be a lot of these things that we're concerned about. Denial of services, GPS corrections, that'd be a big one, okay? So yes, you're right, there are cybersecurity concerns, okay? But a lot of them have existed for a long time too. So, great question.
Yeah, I was wondering if you have any comments on the economics of for example, the precision sprayers. I used to work at John Deere, not anymore, but what I understand is, let's say a grower applies a full volume of herbicide broadcast, but then if they do the precision application, they use less herbicide, so they save money there, but my understanding is the machinery company charges you a subscription, so the grower doesn't save any money, because the cost of the less herbicide plus the subscription is the same as broadcasting the entire field with herbicides. Yeah. So I met growers that said it's the same amount of money, so I don't care enough about the environment to apply less because they still they don't make any money on it.
So what you're saying is John Deere's going after the margins the chemical companies were getting, okay? That's what I thought you heard. Okay, look, let's back up a second, okay? There is going to be different business models for the technology. Generally, the farmer's going to have to buy the hardware, and I think that's the case of John Deere. Then they're going to pay a subscription rate. It could be by acre. It could be annual type subscription rates. I want to be careful here and not get into the weeds too much. We know there's going to be a reduction in volume of herbicides sold. But does that also translate to insecticides and fungicides and nutrients, okay? You're right, Deere is going to want to make their money, and I get that. They have to retire their debt on developing the intelligence. One of my concerns is, who's doing this for farmers that raise cauliflower, okay? I get corn and soybeans. You know, you got 100 million acres in the middle of the U.S., and there's a business model there that makes sense. Part of that AI Institute I was talking about, the intent of it was to democratize AI so that everybody benefits from it. What role is the university going to have? You know, I go back and I think about, in the state of Ohio, if I'm spraying soybeans, fungicides on soybeans, I want Ann Dorrance, who's a plant pathologist, I want her in the cab beside me in the sprayer. Through artificial intelligence, can we do that? And so those are some of the challenges and opportunities that we're going to have. But I agree with you. Everybody's going to be looking to get their piece of the pie, but there should be some left over for the farmer as well. Great point. So,
Professor James Lowenberg de Boer holds the Elizabeth Creek Chair in Agritech Applied Economics at Harper Adams University in the UK, where he is responsible for economics in the Hands-Free Farm team. He is also past president of the International Society of Precision Agriculture and was co-editor of the journal Precision Agriculture. His research focuses on the economics of agricultural technology, especially precision agriculture and crop robotics. James's research and outreach is founded in hands-on experience in agriculture, including production of corn and soybeans in Iowa. And Jess, I'm going to see if I can get you set up here. There we go. I think that works.
There you go.
Okay, so the clicker works.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt, and a great pleasure to be here. I have to respond to that last question about the targeted spraying. And clearly, as competition in the market grows, that we expect, farmers will demand their share of that benefit. But one of the things that's happening in Europe is that some chemicals are being recertified only for targeted spraying. So if a farmer wants access, particularly some of the old chemistry, they have to do it on a targeted basis. They can't do it on a broadcast. So that provides some real incentive for doing the targeted. So let's see if we can get... So what I'd like to talk about here is the economics of variable rate fertilizer. So the economics of some of these technologies that Scott and John have talked about, how the technologies might change the economics of VRT, and then some of the challenges of applying some of those new business models. And the figure there, I put that there to illustrate some of the classic cases. So this is one of my farms in northwest Iowa. I also am a farmer in northwest Iowa. And this is a quarter section, and it's zone sampled. It's because it regularly receives manure applications from a feedlot right to the south. We're required by Iowa State, the state of Iowa, to do some kind of intensive sampling every 4 years. So why do we choose zone sampling? Well, it's cheaper than doing grids. If you did grids, you would do probably 3 or 4 times as many samples on that field, and it would cost you more. So some of those grids, some of those zones are 8 to 10 acres, and there's a real challenge. Every soil scientist that I've talked to says, 8 to 10 acre grids aren't going to tell you what you really need to know. So if we look overall at variable rate, is that it's profitable in niches, and I'm going to talk about one of those niches in a moment. But there are places where farmers have figured out that this really makes them some money. But overall, the adoption has been relatively modest. And this is true not just in the US, this is true worldwide. And this is not true about all precision ag technology. There are some precision ag technologies that have become standard practice. So GPS guidance, whether it's light bars or auto steer, is becoming standard practice all around the world wherever there's mechanized agriculture. If you have tractors and combines, you find GPS guidance. That is not true of variable rate. It's really difficult to find places around the world on a national level or on a regional level where adoption is over 20 to 30% of crop area or number of farms. So why is that happening? Well, there's clearly some problems that occur that affect the economics. One of those is the high cost and low resolution of the sampling. So the most common sampling in the United States is grid sampling. The most common sample size is 2.5 acre or roughly 1 hectare grids. Depending on the soil type and the topography and so on, soil science studies suggest we need, 10 times more than that. We need 10 samples per acre instead of 1 per every 2.5 acres, so that we need a lot higher resolution, but the cost of it is such that that high resolution sampling is not done. There's the cost of doing the individualized prescription maps, and that has, as John pointed out, that has come down. The software and the processes have improved, but it's still a cost in the system. There's a lack of demonstrated value, that there's been literally thousands of variable rate fertilizer trials that have been done worldwide. And some of them show profitability, some of them show losses, most of them show a mixed picture. that it's not a reliable source of profitability. And in most cases, the cost of being wrong, which means probably over-applying, is not charged. So this morning there was and I think it was you that was talking about the surplus. Why is there extra nitrogen and phosphates out there? Well, my argument as a farmer is these are insurance applications. You don't know how much exactly you'll need. You want enough out there for the best possible crop that you could grow, and so you put a little extra on. And that extra costs you the value of that input, but it doesn't have other costs. There's no one charging you for having too much out there. So let's think about the cost of grid sampling. So, zone soil sampling. So Iowa State has some custom rate numbers, and they say that grid soil sampling is in a range from $250 to $950 an acre, and sometimes over that with an average of about 6.5 an acre. So that's an extra cost for doing work. Management zone sampling is a similar cost, but typically management zones are somewhat larger than the 2.5 acre grids, and so maybe a little bit less. There's some soil science research which suggests that roughly 100 meter between samples, which is what a 2.5 acre grid would be, the correlation between samples is very low, and so the kind of mapping that you would typically do, kriging and so on, isn't going to do you make very good maps with that kind of data. This is an example of some of the results that come out, and this is actually, it's an example from one of the first variable rate fertilizer trials that used computerized variable rate application and yield monitors done in DeKalb County, Indiana, starting in 1993. And if you look carefully at the data, we compared there a whole field application, grid application, 2.5 acre grids, and soil type applications. And depending on the year and the crop, one or the other is more profitable. There's no consistent pattern. And this has been true on, again, as I mentioned, on thousands of trials worldwide. So you have this mixed profitability that's occurring. There are those niches where there's some clearer results. So one of those is the variable rate application of nitrogen on sugar beets in the Red River Valley of the North. And if you don't know sugar beets, Red River Valley is where the biggest part of the U.S. Sugar beet crop is produced. And the problem of nitrogen on sugar beets is that if you put too much nitrogen on sugar beets, you get big beets with low sugar content. And the processors hate that. Their processing relies on high sugar content, so they pay a premium on sugar content. If you don't put enough nitrogen on the beets, you don't get a good yield. So you have to find that happy medium. That depends a lot on how much nitrogen is already in the soil. So what's happened starting in the early 90s, there was a move in the Red River Valley to, number one, to identify what those optimal nitrogen rates were, and there were good studies by University of Minnesota, by North Dakota State, by American Crystal Sugar, which is a cooperative, on what those rates were. Crop consultants geared up to do the sampling and the testing. The ag retailers geared up to do the variable rate application. So all of the pieces of the puzzle came together, and studies suggest that a majority of sugar beets in the valley are produced with variable rate nitrogen because it's profitable. And you can see there on the the table, you get, depending on which study and which year and so on, you get profits that range from $48 up to $72 an acre. Well, okay, this is big enough to catch somebody's attention. And it's big enough to notice. So there's a case. You can find other cases. On my own farms in northwest Iowa, I do variable rate lime because we happen to be in an area where soil pH levels are incredibly variable. They vary from 5 up to almost 8 in the same field. And there's no way that you can do a uniform rate application and come out with a happy medium. You get a bunch of the field where you have too much lime, and you get, you started out at 7.7 and now you're up over 8, and that, you get all kinds of micronutrient tie-up and so on. But for the ones that started at 5, it still isn't up into the optimal range. So variable rate makes sense for liming in areas like that. So, Reddy, Scott, and John talked about some of the technology that could make a difference. One of them is soil sensors. So here is the Veris sensor, which includes a soil pH sensor that one of my students invented. It doesn't quite tell you all that you need to know about soil pH because it's not a buffer pH estimate, but it does give you an idea of what could be done with soil sensors. And instead of one sample for 2.5 acres or a 10-acre zone, you would have maybe 10 samples an acre or 20 samples an acre. You have much higher density, and so you could do a better job. More accurate application equipment, and there's been a lot of progress on application equipment. But the question then is that application equipment correctly used? Is it calibrated right? Is it maintained correctly? Just a couple of weeks ago, had an exchange with a grower, an ag retailer who complained endlessly about airflow equipment and the kind of maintenance headaches that they have with those. And if it's not, it may be good technology, but if it's not maintained right, then it isn't going to put the fertilizer where you want it to be. Digital twins and AI to better utilize some of that sensor data, and Scott talked about that. Autonomy to reduce the time pressure. So if you're expecting high accuracy application of inputs, whether that's fertilizer or crop protection or whatever it is, and you're expecting to do that in a piece of equipment driven by a human through a field at 15 miles an hour, well, that's really, really tough. If you could do it with a robot that's moving methodically from plant to plant at a slow pace and works 24 hours a day, well, this gives you a better chance to get that done. And that leads to individual plant management. So instead of trying to put inputs out there, a blanket uniform rate for whole fields, we start thinking about what does this plant need on this spot this year, right now, at this time. Site-specific microbiome management, and we know there's incredible variability out there in the microbiome. How do we manage that better? This morning, Nathan talked a bit about the crop rotation and cover crop issues. We know there's an important interaction there with fertilizer applications. And then on the output side, right now there's no place in the world that I know of, and maybe John and Scott, you know of places where over applications of fertilizer are that there's some kind of cost to the farmer of doing that. I don't know any place where they do that. It's all treated as non-point source pollution. But if every tile drainage line had a sensor on it, then the economics would all of a sudden look quite different. And then there's a whole issue of business models for doing that. It's one thing to have the technology. It's the other thing to talk about how will that business be rolled out and how will farmers get access to it. Will they own the equipment themselves and do the work, make the decisions on their own? Will they hire crop consultants? Will they hire contractors to do the application? What are the economies of scale in any of those? So there's all those business models out there. There's ideas of making soil fertility and soil health a service. So instead of buying tons of fertilizer, you might pay a company to achieve some kind of soil health goal on your farm and pay by the hectare or pay by the acre. There's a whole question of to what extent do we do data-based decision making, and John showed some of the data about the increased use of data among ag retailers in the U.S. And again, the question we ask there, and I'm part of the writing of those questionnaires, is not very exact. We ask them if they use data. Now, we don't know how they use that data. Maybe they just glance at a yield map and say, oh, well, hey, that area looks good. Let's repeat whatever we did there. Or do they do some number crunching? So there's a big difference there. But do we do database decision making versus doing it based on intuition and traditional practices? The whole question of pay-as-you-go agronomy services, so you're paying by the ton of fertilizer and whatever services come with that are kind of part of the marketing, or do you separately pay for consultancy services? Do we try, both at the farm level and at the agribusiness level, do we try to manage for a circular economy? Do we pay attention to recycling of those products, or are we looking at this mainly as an extractive industry? We're trying to extract as many crops as we can out of this soil and put as little in as we have to, or do we look at it in a regenerative framework? All of those are business cases. And then there's a whole case of closer farm to consumer linkages. And this is one of the things you learn in Europe, that where many more consumers are interested in where their food came from. And to some extent are willing to pay a slight premium if they know that it's produced in a sustainable way. Or certainly they will go shop at a certain place where there is some evidence that that food is more sustainably produced. Ideally, it's, okay, if it's the same price, I'd rather go to the place that pays attention to sustainability than to go to this other location that doesn't do that. So there's a real issue there of business models. What are some of the constraints to changing those business models? And one of the big ones is just risk aversion. You don't know. If you don't know what the outcome is going to be, and business survival is an issue. It's really tough to make money selling people products. So risk aversion is there. There's resistance to change, but in my experience, if farmers in particular can see a benefit for themselves, either monetary-wise or in some other way, it isn't resistance to change. It's more, there's a risk aversion issue. There are issues around lack of knowledge and skills. I don't understand this particular technology. I don't understand how to use it effectively. I haven't seen my neighbors use it. There's the issue of access to adequate capital. In the U.S., agriculture is fairly well capitalized, but certainly around the world, access to capital is a very big issue. Short planning horizons is a big issue in the U.S. A big part of farmland in the U.S. is rented on a year-to-year basis. This is a big contrast to Europe, where you have multi-year rental agreements, and in some places you may have multi-generational rental agreements. In England, depending on what kind of lease you have, your grandchildren may have a right to rent that land. And so you pay a different attention to what happens than if it's only a year lease. Infrastructure limitations and the broadband access, it's one thing, and there's really good data that shows limited broadband access in rural areas in the US, and the same is true in Europe. But that's mostly focused on farmsteads. The broadband access out in fields is even lower than that. So there's infrastructure regulations, there's regulatory barriers. And we can talk there about all kinds of issues. I've worked a lot in the autonomy area, and in the US, in the state of California, there's some real strict regulations on human supervision requirements for crop robots. In Europe, under the machinery directive, there's some similar directives. In Europe, they're on the road to changing that. I think in 2026, they will have a new set of directives that make that more flexible. And in one of the few places where Britain has an advantage, Britain has a code of conduct for code of practice for mobile crop autonomous machines that allows growers a lot of flexibility. But there are regulatory issues. There's market access issues, and then there's social pressures. If all of your neighbors think it's crazy, it better be really, really profitable for you to do it. But if all of them think it's a really good idea, then you might be more likely to give it a try. So, okay, what do you think about here? So variable rate fertilization with current technology has lagged worldwide. And this is not just true in the US, it's true worldwide. Denmark has some of the best precision ag adoption statistics in the world, and the last time they asked the question, 7% of crop area in Denmark was managed with variable rate technology. That's really low, and in spite of the fact that Denmark has a really good extension system, really good ag research. It's not a question, and Danish farmers by and large are very well educated, and so it's not a question of information. This is a question of them making an assessment of this technology and finding it wanting. Technology in the pipeline could make variable rate fertilization more attractive to farmers. And then with or without that new technology, there are some business models that could improve fertilization efficiency. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
We have time for one or two questions here.
Thank you. I'm Carl Wyant with Nutrien. I ran a precision ag service here in Arizona for a large ag retailer, and your picture of the Varus cart brought back nightmares. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I got it.
I figured out how to rip out all the cabling to lower and raise it up off the ground, and had to MacGyver my way out of a field. It's a good time. We had a grower here, a large landowner, who rented out most of their ground, and what they were doing was having us go map all the zones for each field, and then they would charge their tenants an extra $1 or $2 an acre because they had the maps already made, these nutrient maps. Have you seen that as a possible incentive for more mapping of fields as we move through this rental market?
You mean that farmers would pay extra money for having that soils data?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I have not seen that. I think it's a possibility, and if farmers could, if it was cheaper for them to do it that way, I think that that's a possibility. But I have not seen anybody else try that model.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Jess. Okay, our last speaker before we go to the discussion is Dr. Steve Phillips. Steve holds a PhD from Oklahoma State University and has over 20 years of experience in leading applied agronomic research and educational outreach programs focused on improving the performance of diverse cropping systems around the world using precision ag technologies. He is currently an associate professor of soil fertility at Oklahoma State University and serves as senior consulting scientist for the African Plant Nutrition Institute headquartered in Morocco. And Steve, I'll pass it over to you then. Set up now. Try it out, make sure,
Yeah, all right. Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you, everyone, for being here. Originally, I was going to lead us off with the precision management and the agronomy talk, but as we started looking at all this, a lot of the common themes that John and Jess and Scott have all addressed regarding lower than expected adoption rates and some of the challenges demonstrating profitability with some of these technologies. A lot of that can be explained with the agronomy that's gone into this. Because Matt asked at the beginning, what's the definition of precision pea management? It's not that there's technology involved. It's that we want to account for and incorporate our understanding of spatial and temporal variability in our management of phosphorus. And this is something that as we work outside the U.S., particularly in Africa, dealing with these smallholders, Jess mentioned that a little bit of insurance phosphorus is not a problem. Well, that's a big problem in a big part of the world, that the risk of making the wrong decision, the implications are much greater. And so in agronomy, we've really started to shift our focus toward the spatial resolution of what we're doing, and we've recognized that a lot of our existing recommendations that we're trying to utilize in precision agriculture were never intended to be precise. They were built to be accurate, and they are. But when we try to shoehorn an accurate recommendation system into a high-resolution precision management, we come into some challenges. And that's really where we're going to go today. Matt also mentioned Josh McGrath. And Josh and I were originally going to tag team the agronomy part of it, but since he's out, I'm going to basically present his data for him. This is a project that when I was with IP&I, we actually started with Josh several years ago, looking at this high-resolution crop response to fertilizer inputs. And so I'm going to show a lot of that data, but backing up a step, in terms of our traditional soil fertility, in terms of recommendations based on soil testing, we've tended to follow a pretty standard stepwise process where we'll collect a soil sample. Used to be a composite for the whole field. Now, as Jess demonstrated, very high percentage are using some sort of precision sampling, either grid sampling or zone sampling, using various parameters. But that soil ends up in the lab. We determine what is the nutrient content of that soil. What does that mean in terms of fertilizer recommendation or fertilizer need by the plants growing in that soil? We make a recommendation and then an application. We didn't change this approach at all when we started moving toward precision fertilizer management. We stayed with what we had and tried to apply it to a whole new set of circumstances. And so in terms of our standard soil test-based fertilizer recommendation system, it's a two-step process, correlation and calibration. And all of you remember that from your intro to fertility course, those of you that have agronomy degrees, whereas basically we want to determine at what level of soil test would we expect a response to fertilizer. And that's the correlation part of the curve where, for example, we'd identify with this linear plateau model a critical level below which we would expect a response to fertilizer, above we would not. And so what we have found is that we do this work with basically an insufficient and sufficient treatment within many, many fields of different soil test levels. And so we end up with a large database of responsive and non-responsive sites to fertilizer without any other measured parameter of drivers that may affect that responsiveness, whether it be biological, other chemical factors. We try to normalize some of this with the fertility, but there's biological and physical drivers that affect, particularly the case of phosphorus dynamics, that aren't accounted for in this standard correlation curve. Then we use calibration data where now we'll go out to fields at varying soil test levels, put out a range of fertilizer rates, and look at what it took in terms of fertilizer to get us to that critical level. Again, not considering a lot of the other spatial and temporal drivers that may or may not exist in a particular field. And so when we move into precision management or higher resolution application of this strategy, there are things that we understand we have, and we're getting to the point where we're getting a much better understanding of what we lack in terms of being able to apply this effectively. What we have, and John talked about this, we have the ability technologically to apply varying rates at a very high resolution. We've been able to do that and becoming even more so. We've done it with nitrogen for a long time. Beginning now, the multiple bin system is something that we needed to come along for a long time because of the multi-nutrient analyses of a lot of the commonly used sources, the distribution patterns of older technology on the spinner spreaders. In fact, John did a lot of this work it's been probably 10, 15 years ago, where he was looking at a multi-nutrient source and the distribution of the different particles of fertilizer. We were actually creating our own variation within the field due to spreader technology. A lot of that's been addressed, but we can apply. The agronomy doesn't match the precision of the technology, of the application technology. And this has been a case of engineering versus agronomic science. Engineers and scientists is that we on the agronomic side always tend to lag a little behind in the development and the marketing of certain technologies. And so as we start catching up, we're not set up to make a precise fertilizer application prescription at the resolution that we have the technology to apply it. And that's a shortfall. We don't develop recommendations at that resolution either, because, as I'll show you, this is one of the things that we were trying to work with Josh, and I'll just hold my comments on that till we get to that. Well, what we need is a higher resolution characterization of the plant need, because one of the things, in my opinion, that was an oversight when we started this is that we recognized spatial variability in soil phosphorus concentrations, that our correlation varied across the field. But then we applied that same calibration curve to all these different areas. And if you think about it, something's going on in these fields that have had a uniform application of phosphorus based on an average soil test. So now we're going in and we either grid or zone by some guidelines, and we're identifying these areas of the field that over time have developed different phosphorus concentrations. Something's going on there that caused that to happen, yet we don't account for any of that in our recommendation systems at the higher resolution. We apply the same calibration curve, which I think is not right. I think that we need more information other than just soil test P to make a precise fertilizer recommendation relative to plant response to that nutrient, in addition to just the amount of nutrients that there. What's the likelihood of plant response to that? And we see that especially in our current recommendations in that medium category, that the range of responsiveness is huge. We're at a certain point, we're quite confident we'll respond to fertilizer. Then we get beyond that critical point, we're very confident we won't. But it's that middle range that, the randomness there is something that we have averaged out in our traditional soil fertility recommendation systems. And so our project with Josh, we wanted to look at how fine of a resolution do we have to do in grid sampling, cost not being a factor, just agronomically, what is the resolution that we should be working at to grid sample? And so he went out and set a couple of large fields there in Kentucky and did 1/10 of an acre grid sampling in these fields. And then they went back and did the standard 2.5 acre correlation and the 1/10 of an acre correlation. And you can see this is the same field, so you can already see a little variation in these zones. And so if we pull out just a few individual points, what you see is that we know, and as Jess pointed out, we knew in the 90s when we started doing this that 2.5 acre grids weren't going to work in terms of interpolating between those points. The distance is just too great. Even knowing what we knew back then, it's geostatistically a fact that that's just too far away for those points to be considered alike. And so we get down to even a 1/10 of an acre, we still, you see, we're doing much better, but we're still missing within interpolation. And that's because the point is, and this was shown in another piece of work done back in the 90s by Bill Rahn's group at Oklahoma State University. Bill Rahn and John Soley did some high-resolution forage and soil sampling and found that 9 square feet was the field element size. That point where they could pick up a statistical difference from one cell to the next was less than 1 square meter in both forage production, soil P, soil K, and pH, and organic matter in that test, less than a square meter. So even at a 1/10 of an acre, we're missing the true value on a given point. And like Jess mentioned, if we go to plant by plant management, we're missing it, even at that high resolution. The point is not that we need smaller grids. The point is, I don't know if grids work at any resolution in terms of identifying a highly probable response to a fertilizer input that affects yield in that very high resolution scale. The counterpoint to that would be something that John and I got into a discussion. We did an event down in Brazil where 2.5 acres is a pretty high resolution for grid sampling down there. They're taking a sample every 5 to 10 hectares down there. And so the argument would be, what's the point of that? There's absolutely no value. There's no value statistically. But the argument there is, well, any time we can subdivide a field using any strategy, even a composite sample from half the field versus other half the field, is more information. It's more site-specific information to make a decision. So the argument becomes there, what's a service, and we'll get into this a little in the discussion, what's a service that farmers find value in? The farmer-centric driven service offerings is where we work, especially outside the U.S. We focus a lot on that, is that what do farmers need? What's the information they want, and how do they want to receive it? And then how do we support that service with science? So Josh also in this project was looking at, all right, well, what is the responsiveness now? We understand that we're missing out on some true value soil test phosphorus availability. What's that mean in terms of response to that fertilizer? And so he went out in several of these fields that were on average probably 20 acres in size, did the 1/10 of an acre grid sampling, and then put out these 40 by 40 blocks with either sufficient, which was 60 pounds P2O5 per acre in this case, or 0. And so we had a range of soil test recommendations, and we put out check plots and treated plots, which would be sufficient regardless of soil test, to look at responsiveness. And what his data showed was that regardless of the soil test level, about half the time plots responded to the phosphorus fertilizer when we expected it to. And this is almost exactly the outcome that some other work done by Brian Arnell on double crop soybeans is published a couple of years ago by Vaughn Reed, who's now the fertility specialist at Mississippi State. They also found about 50% of the time crops would respond to phosphorus application when we expected it to, and about half the time it wouldn't. When we get into potassium, it's a whole other deal where we don't expect response and we see it about half the time. And so there's other things happening outside of just the available plant nutrient that's affecting mobilization, nutrient dynamics in the soil, interaction with other nutrients, the role of microbes, Jess mentioned that, physical characteristics of the soil, morphological characteristics. All these drivers are affecting the availability and the way the plant can utilize the nutrient that may be there. It may not be able to access it during the growing season. And this just illustrates more of what I was saying, that we're really good with our traditional systems. Our average soil fertility recommendations are very accurate, and they work. They're especially good at showing us where we don't expect a response. Where we get into issues as we start getting down here into these more responsive soil test levels, a lot of variability on whether we can expect a response or not. Here's a follow-up to some of that work that Josh did, and Jenny Friedgen was involved in this. And this shows that as yield potential increases, the probability of response to a fertilizer input decreases. Now, this is not what we see with nitrogen. There was some work that came out, it's probably been 10 years now, that showed that there was no correlation whatsoever between yield potential and response to fertilizer. But nitrogen is a whole different animal than phosphorus. And so the situation with phosphorus is that we do have a negative correlation. Obviously, that fit is not great in some of these locations, but they're all negatively correlated. And so as delta yield goes down, the probability of response to fertilizer goes up. And Josh's takeaway from that was that when plants don't have early season access to phosphorus, I mean there's some limiting layer, then there will be a response. This delta yield will be larger. Whereas then you have full access to the soil, then the check plot yield is greater, the crop has more time to respond to this, and then your delta yield is smaller, which would explain part of this. And they were just hypothesizing. They had no data to support this. This was just their guess at the time. But we just finished a student, she was one of Dr. Jason Warren's students at Oklahoma State, where her study was looking at years of yield maps on commercial fields for soybeans, wheat, corn, and sorghum. And she took all that and then went out and took some 4-foot cores out of this field, several points within the field, and did a morphological characterization of these cores and looked at several soil health factors that Jess mentioned maybe we're going to move to, and found a positive correlation between crop yield and the depth to a limiting layer, whether that be a clay pan, an accumulation of clay, glaying, soil moisture, any type of restrictive layer was correlated with the yield in that area. And these were uniformly managed fields. These were farmer fields that she just had access to the yield data. And so that depth to limiting layer factor kind of ties in with some of what Josh was hypothesizing, that there are physical barriers that we may pick up plenty of phosphorus in the soil test, but if there's that limiting layer below the 6 inches where we're pulling the sample, or maybe even 4 inches in a no-till situation, then what we're saying about the potential for responsiveness might not be true, because we missed that early season growth and the inability of the plant roots to penetrate that limiting layer for access to the phosphorus that the other crops are finding below that sampled layer. And so as we move into the discussion, some of the things that we'll talk about is, we know that grid sampling, as currently done, is too coarse statistically for us to interpolate precisely between sampling points. But, I mean, do we completely throw that out? Or do we say, well, it's a good start, but there are other factors at play that we need to get into? I don't know what we do with that. The traditional REC system, again, they're built to be accurate. We're trying to use them for precision, and we're having a hard time with that. There are things that we've done where we've averaged out of a lot of the variability, whereas now we have the technology to treat very, very fine, high-resolution areas in the field. Our traditional recommendation systems were never calibrated to do that. And so what do we do with that information, with that reality? Do we recalibrate? We've wanted to recalibrate soil test recs in the university for 25 years. Since I was a graduate student in the 90s, we've known we need to recalibrate. As genetic improvements and yield potentials go up, there's no money to do it. There's definitely no money to be able to have site-specific calibrations using our standard correlation calibration methodologies. So where do we go? What else do we use? We're going to need something else. We need more information. We started, at IPNI, we started a potassium work group, and one of the big takeaways was that our soil test isn't really telling us everything we need to know about potassium requirement in a lot of these crops. You know, we've got to have more plant information. We've got to have we've got to have residue information. There's a lot more site-specific information, and that's where we get into precision ag. It's a site-specific information on spatial and temporal variability that we've got to figure out how we incorporate into our recommendation systems to truly move to precision nutrient management, whether it be phosphorus, potassium, whatever the case. Precision management, we're going to have more information than just our traditional correlated and calibrated soil test recommendations.
We've got sites where we're trying to test things and we're looking for low phosphorus sites because we think we'll get a response, and we don't. And it's a very low phosphorus site. So we're just kind of perplexed by it. So again, it sounds like you're still trying to figure out yourselves, but.
Yeah, well, this, you know, Josh just finished this work in 2021, I think. You know, he changed jobs, and then he had postdocs and grad students handling a lot of this data. So none of this has even been published yet. Where in fact, Vaughn is working on getting some, and Josh probably mentioned this to you, that in 2024, we ought to see the first publications coming out of this. But those of us that have been involved in that project have initiated a little more exploratory type work to figure out if we thought it was going to be microbial. That was our original hypothesis was, yeah, we're going to find something, and we brought microbiologists into that UK team, and Jason also with his students' work was looking at, you know, changes in CO2 bursts spatially with these different things, and there's nothing there that we can find. I mean, we really thought in the case of P it was going to be the microbes were going to explain a big part of this, but we can't find that. And so now we're on a little more of the physical aspects, kind of thinking more about that. And so we've started some work in Oklahoma. Vaughn is starting some in Mississippi. Josh, with his new position in ARS, I know that's going to be a high priority for him, is to start chasing some of this, you know, with the USDA money. So hopefully that we're going to start to see some investment in some of this. I mean, because this high resolution work is not cheap, you know. So, you know, for us to really figure out what's going on there, it's going to cost some money. But we think this is probably a better return on the investment for those funds than just recalibrating the PRECs.
Yeah.
All right, well, we've got about 25 minutes now for our moderated discussion. We've got 3 topics that as a group we've decided we want to discuss and engage you. I mean, we're a small group. I think the best way is probably just to keep this informal. And so I'm going to begin by asking each of the panelists to start us off. And then if you have a comment, feel free to join in the conversation. We've got 25 minutes, so we'll spend 7 to 8 minutes on each topic, try to get each of these guys to make a comment, and then maybe some thoughts. And yeah, if we don't get through everything, yeah, that we've still got the pedal house. We can finish up the pedal house tonight. So first off, John and Jess kind of hit on, you know, the lack of adoption, and both of them went through several services that are currently offered to farmers. And so I'm going to start with you, John. What have we got now? I mean, you mentioned guidance, and Jess also went that there are certain technologies that are ready to go, that adoption's very high. But on the ones that aren't, where are we missing our opportunity to serve farmers' needs? What have we got out there that isn't working the way it should, and what do farmers need that we don't currently offer as a precision ag service.
Jess,
John, you want, well, either one of you.
I'm just going to say education. We've got some tools out there that require, it's not a turnkey. These turnkey like guidance, that's a pretty straightforward technology to use. But some of these more advanced, if not some that require a little bit more time and understanding to find benefit in, we don't have the education out there for growers to take advantage of them.
I wouldn't disagree with the need for education, but I think what we really need is tools that are easier to use. And I think AutoSteer is a classic case because it's become easy to use. You know, the original technology took a little bit of tinkering to get it to work, but it's now more or less become a push button sort of thing. But VRT isn't push button, and it doesn't offer the kind of reliable results. So if we're thinking about the kinds of services that are needed, we need some lower cost, high resolution soil sampling. However you do that, that's what we need. We need better ways to integrate all of that information. And Steve, you pointed out the need for information beyond just the soil test to figure out what's going on with P and K. Well, how do you do that? And some kind of decision support that would effectively do that is greatly needed that I don't see that's out there. And just to remind you that in crop agriculture, it's really difficult to find an example of any kind of decision support that's widely used. There aren't very many good examples out there. And you know, you can find a lot of argument about why that happens, but part of it is that they've all been too difficult to use and too requiring too much background and too much input. And farmers don't become farmers because they want to sit behind a computer. They become farmers usually, at least in the US, because they want an outdoor lifestyle, they want to be active in a certain way, they want to farm, not do administration.
Scott?
I'm going to be Mr. Obvious here, but everything we're doing today is predicated on taking a soil core and taking it to a laboratory for analysis. We've heard for a long time now we're going to have these on-the-go sensors. Since the mid-1990s, they've never materialized, okay? So largely the expense in the system, a lot of the uncertainty in the system is because of the expense, but it's all predicated on pulling that soil core and getting it to a laboratory and getting test results back from a wet chemistry process in a lot of cases. And until that changes, I don't know that we're going to see a big movement in variable rate technology.
I agree.
Nathan?
Yeah, so I've got a question about the soil sampling issue and some of what you had talked about as well. Is it most of what people do is they take a point sample and then extrapolate or interpolate between point samples. And I think like back in old textbooks and stuff, they say, well, what if you do a cell sample? What if you were to divide it up into a grid and then rather than trying to extrapolate, treat each acre or whatever as its own individual small field? Is there any increase in accuracy if we just change our sampling protocol? It's takes a lot more work to take that type of a sample, but is it more valuable?
Well, I'll answer. On Josh's work, those 1/10 of an acres were grid cell sampled. Those were composite samples from each 1/10 of an acre grid cell. Yeah, so they weren't grid point, they were grid cell samples. So.
Interject, the majority of the data is interpolated that ultimately goes to the map. Whether that's right or wrong, but regardless, whether it's 5 points or 100 points representing a field.
I'm going to add another thought into this, and I think Steve touched on this. I worked with a gentleman by the name of Tom Mueller at the University of Kentucky, and some of you might know Tom. But Tom was very focused on geospatial statistics, and what he convinced me of is small scale of variability being so problematic in terms of phosphorus. When it came to pH and some of the other nutrients, we didn't quite see that small scale variability. And so he convinced me, just looking at that, it really boiled down to what nutrients you were trying to manage in terms of what the sampling approach should be, if that makes any sense. So.
Thank you all. I operate in a very different type of system than what you've described in protected agriculture, and we do extensive use of differential sap analysis. We're looking at the nutrient mobility between older leaves and younger leaves, and sending leaf samples from both to a lab in Holland every 2 weeks and making our decisions based on that. Is this an approach that you've considered at all?
Yeah, the plant information we think is critical. The issue is what you're describing is basically a destructive methodology. It's the same thing. I mean, we've still got to collect a high enough number of samples to represent spatial variability in sap concentration of nutrients. And so, I mean, where's that economically favorable break point where we are getting spatially precise recommendations based on that? Again, it's an accurate assessment of plant nutrient status, and it would help us understand any mistake we're making or misinterpretation of a soil test report. But in terms of a service, we're kind of in the same boat, in my opinion, with something like that.
We are doing, you'll find areas that are heavily invested in doing tissue sampling. And not everywhere, but you'll get some of our retailers totally believe in it and they do it. But the problem with that is it's just a snapshot for that time and when it's collected. And if you did a temporal sampling, meaning I went over multiple days, and it's going to change drastically in the mobilization of that within the plant. So what is it telling you? And that's been the challenge, is the cost, the appropriate do it to collect those tissue samples to be informative to make some kind of application decision. We're just getting a quick temporal, yep, that's what it was at that hour during that day, and it doesn't really give me an indication of what I need to do to apply nitrogen in particular is what you'll see people basing that on.
This is a nice transition into the next topic. Yeah, you have one specific to this first one?
Related to that, yeah. And
sure.
I think, when you sample the crop, you miss the potential environmental impacts, because crop uptake maybe is related, but not fully related to what you leave on the field, what leaves the field, which is kind of like one of my related questions to STP, and I think it was brought up, the other components of phosphorus, because in that plot from Josh, where it was like half and half, it worked, it didn't work. Like in modeling world, if something is 50%, we say it's not really great, because you could just say, toss it up to a coin toss and I figure out what to apply. So, I think like if there's opportunity to move to a more holistic soil test and not just STP to maybe improve some of those, curves of where that critical value is.
Do you have a comment, or you're just taking
I was
the
going
mic?
to jump on top of that actually and say that, so basically, has anyone developed models, process models that take into things like soil texture and other things that have been used in an explanatory fashion and developed better precision recommendations? So if you add more explanatory variables, has anyone come up with anything that's improved upon the state of the art based on just the STP right now?
Great question, because our next discussion topic is what can we do to update existing algorithms? I mean, what else can we use? What's available to us in a high-resolution, spatially variable, precise manner that avoids the black box problem, and that's the answer to a lot of your comment about the on-the-go sensors, is, no one wants the rig to come back with an as-applied map and never have seen the to-be-applied map. And so that was one of our challenges. So I'm going to start this with you, Scott. What can you envision being data layers that might help us do a better job in precision nutrient management?
Totally out of my area of expertise. But, you know, I think we have to go back and think about how some of our soils formed and use that as one of the keys in terms of what the response might be. The other thing that confuses that a lot is how those soils were managed historically. And the example I'm going to use, and I think everybody's aware of this, at least in the Midwestern part of the U.S., what we've done is taken smaller fields and composited those into larger fields, if you will. In other words, we took out all the fence rows, we removed all the buildings and everything, and we began farming those as major units. There was a reason why we farmed those differently early on in time. And so I think we also have to be careful, and I'm reminded by a farmer I work with in Kentucky, they used rock phosphate as their source of phosphorus. And you'd be out in the field sampling, and goes, don't sample over there, that's where they unloaded the rock phosphate at. And so I just look at all those things that humans have done historically to create some of that variability as well, but I gotta believe there's something in terms of the formation of soils that is important to the process as well.
Mm-hmm. Jess, you mentioned the Veris rig and some biplant work. How do you envision that as an economist being part of a strategy to make a better recommendation?
So, you know, and I'm not the engineer, but the economic vision of this is that you have some kind of robot that goes through the field looking at each plant. And rather than sending off that that tissue sample to a lab, it looks at the spectral signature of those leaves and figures out, okay, this plant needs P, or it doesn't need it, needs K, or doesn't need it, or this plant is susceptible to some plant disease and we better treat that now before it gets too far along. Mm-hmm. And with conventional technology with human drivers, that's impossible because you have to be moving too fast through the field in order to make it cost effective. But with autonomy, those kinds of things become feasible. So I think we can think of what kind of data layers would be effective, but it's also what kind of system is that put in within. And then the whole question arises, is that robot, does a farmer own that one? And there's a whole issue of the value of the information that presumably if this is AI, it's learning as it goes. And so a robot that's done this for a couple of years should be better at it than one that is newly from the factory. Or is this, you know, an Uber type service that, you know, the farmer gets on his or her cell phone and orders the robot to come in and do this. So there's a lot of discussion and lots of issues around what kind of business model that's embedded into, as well as what kind of information is needed.
Yeah, what you're describing there also brings in the challenge of, because now we would be talking about an in-season rescue application. If we're picking up plant by plant nutrient deficiencies, then in theory, when we do that, it's with the intention of making some sort of in-season application. Mm-hmm. John, how does the data management fit into all this? Because you mentioned some very high statistics of Ohio farmers in particular using data to inform decision-making, and a very high percentage find VRT to be a profitable practice. As we think about evolving our recommendation algorithms, how does data fit into that?
So that goes to Matt and I guess Becca's comments, that we got to think how to put the data together. So for example, we have, you know, you can go to A&L Labs or Midwest Labs, and they have years of data, right, of soil analysis data, but they don't have the other data fit with it, right, that includes things like, well, ultimately yield is something we always want to have as a response variable in that. And then texture, they got that. So they've got some of these pieces, I think, Matt, that begins to explore, and those people, one lab in particular, have asked the questions that you asked. Are they doing it? No, because they don't have the yield to go with the sampling. Now, I will tell you, as thinking forward here is when we start putting those together and we combining them with AI and start to think differently potentially, and we could use some standard statistics possibly on the front edge. For example, I was telling Scott this other day, I was at a soil lab, and they actually have been collecting yield data, yield maps, and connecting that to their analysis for some fields to think about what the future could be and how, right? Because the argument that I would make is in Ohio, every field or subfield has a different critical value labeled to it, for P in particular, right? It's just not 40 parts per million for every field. It varies, we know that. But we choose to use one value in our recommendations. With that said, is with the yield data and knowing texture and some of these other things, and you put all that together, now you can start to explore what is potentially the critical value, not only in that field, but potentially in these subfield regions and start to understand what are some of the levers. I'm not going to say it's going to answer all of our questions, but we'll have a little bit more depth of analysis than what we have today. And think about having every county, if not a lot of fields within counties, in that analysis because it's connected up. So my comment to that is, I think as we start to bring data together, if we can begin to do that, we'll start to bring some analysis and think more site specifically on how it deals with some of the challenges we're talking here today.
They're going to be moving the air wall here in a couple minutes, so we probably need to wrap things up. Sorry about that, a couple minutes early because we have to get the final session underway.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, the last one is a quickie. Any thoughts on this data incorporation? Yeah.
This discussion is really interesting. I think about
You want to give her the mic?
this discussion is really interesting in thinking about the value of this data, not only to the farmers and the companies that are making recommendations, but also to some of the, research and conservation work that is out there. I'm kind of curious, I'm working with University of Florida IFAS on a project with USDA and Embrapa in Brazil, and very much learning more about all of this, but I'm kind of curious about what not only like these businesses that have proprietary AI and the data that comes from that, but just in general, farmers' perceptions about sharing their yield and things like that. Have you all run into that conversation?
That's been going on for a while. Jess, you want to take this? This is some questions from the survey we asked these.
Yeah, and this is an old question, and the basic point is that farmers don't have a motivation to share data. They do have motivations to keep it very closely. They're worried about the data being misused, either to sell them stuff or for regulatory purposes. And so they'd rather keep it to themselves. And the only successes that we've seen in sharing data is there are some retailers, for instance, that build up enough trust that they can share data. And one of the things that comes out of the crop life study is that the number of dealers that analyze data only within their dealerships, among their customer base, is quite high. The ones that pool beyond that is really low. We can talk about, so some people talk about anonymizing data and making it and they do some of this in medicine. But one of the problems is that, a soil map, for instance, is, you can do a pretty basic image search and you can figure out pretty quickly which field this came from and who owns it and who farms it. And so this anonymizing idea just probably won't work in agriculture. So there's some real barriers there to achieving the kind of the data, as you pointed out, you need millions of observations, whether it's images or whatever it is, in order to make AI work. For anything that requires pooled data, it's going to take a long, long time. And my bet is the first examples that we see coming out of this is going to come out of very large farming operations in places like, Ukraine or Brazil. So I worked in Ukraine with Colonel, and this was before the war, they were farming well over 1 million hectares. And that's enough data to start giving you a base to do this. But unfortunately, they had other issues that intervened, and they're going to stop them from doing that. So there's some real challenges there, not technological, but on the business and trust side.
All right, go ahead.
Great. Let's have a round of applause for the panelists. Thank you all very much.